back to another edition of Battlefield 101. This is the last video I put together in a sequence of tank tutorials, and we're going to focus on some of the more attack-minded perks and weapon upgrades that you can select as a driver in helping you deal with threats from the enemy opposition. Now the loadout you leave base with, that you leave deployment with, is definitely going to have an effect on what kind of an impact you can have on the match and how you ought to tactically approach it. This may also be dependent on whether you are working with a gunner who you trust to be able to deal with infantry threats, whilst the tank's focus lies elsewhere on the driver's side. And it will also may be dependent on whether you are facing opposition who really know what they're doing, potentially in a helicopter or another tank, or whether the real threat is coming from the infantry. Now if you happen to be driving around in a tank where you do not trust your gunner for whatever reason to be dealing with threats from infantry sources, or maybe that you're on your own and don't have access to a gunner, or maybe that the match that you're in, the biggest threat is coming from the foot soldiers such as rocket launchers and C4runners, I would recommend the coaxial HMG, certainly over the starting coaxial LMG, which is the same caliber machine gun available to the gunner in the gunner seat in a tank. The coaxial HMG is far more damaging. You can deal out damage to lightly skinned vehicles such as jeeps, helicopters, and even the enemy LAV if you happen to come across one of those. It won't damage enemy tanks, however. And as you can see from these clips, the HMG is pretty damn accurate. Another benefit to it over the LMG is the fact that there is just no cooldown period to have to worry about. This thing just does not overheat. And this for me is the go-to secondary to select more often than not in Battlefield 4. No matter how good a tank driver you are or how weak the opposition is, there are two types of soldiers in the support and recon looking to drop C4. There are engineers with access to all different kinds of rockets who are all looking to blow up the tank. So dealing with threats from the infantry is a constant menace in the tank, and the HMG allows you to deal with it easier than any other secondary weapon. Now if you have enough of an understanding and trust in your gun to be able to deal with the infantry threats by themselves, you could as a driver select a laser-guided shell as a secondary weapon. What the laser-guided shell does is it locks onto and finds an enemy ground vehicle, and you can then fire shells over long distances and get a guaranteed hit. Without the benefit of a SOFLAM in some form or other, it will not take out enemy air vehicles for you. We'll get onto that in a second. But what does this mean from a tactical position? Well, if you choose to play a more passive role for your team whilst in the tank, what you can do is use the laser guiding mechanism to try and locate and spot enemy ground vehicles and potentially engage them over long range distances. As long as an enemy ground vehicle comes within its field of vision, it will automatically begin a locking process, which you can then use to spot the enemy vehicle or potentially engage it over long range distances yourself. Now against another enemy tank, the laser guided shell will typically deal 34 damage per shot. It doesn't matter if the enemy tank is facing forwards, to the rear or the side, because the shell travels upwards into the air and then comes crashing down on the roof, so it will typically deal a base amount of damage every time you fire the shell. Now taking this tactical approach will probably keep you out of harm's way for most of the time. In a conquest game you'll not need to necessarily be in and around the flags. However, because you're staying well away from the actual combat zone, you're probably not going to score an awful lot of points. However, if you choose to play this style and you plan on avoiding any contact with enemy infantry, you could go the whole hog and ask your gunner to equip the SOFLAM secondary weapon. This will allow you to deal out a lot more damage to enemy ground vehicles. Instead of a 34 base rate damage against enemy tanks, you can deal out 50, meaning you can take out any enemy ground vehicle with a maximum of 2 shots. Plus you'll get the added benefit of being able to engage the enemy air vehicles such as the helicopter here. Using the SOFLAM in conjunction with the laser guided shell means there is a double lock-on process, increasing the length of time it takes in order to get a shot away. This means that taking out choppers is not usually a problem, but taking out fast moving jets is usually a difficult thing to do. In this instance we do manage to get a shot away. However, it wasn't enough to kill the jet in one go, but we did enough damage in order to force the pilot to bail out. Now if as a driver you want to focus your attention on taking out enemy ground vehicles and you have a gunner that you trust to be able to deal with the infantry threat, but you don't want to use laser guided because perhaps you want to be in amongst the objectives and not reliant on a long range laser locking mechanism, you can select staff shell as a secondary weapon. Now you may have noticed I switched out reactive armor as a perk and equipped autoloader in its place. If you recall the last episode of Battlefield 101, I accused reactive armor of being a fail perk that had no practical use in the game. However, autoloader certainly does not come into that category. What it does is it allows you to reload both your primary and secondary shell, in this case the staff shell, at a far quicker rate than you can do conventionally, allowing me to essentially outgun my opponent. In that case, I used every tool in my arsenal to destroy the enemy tank, and I only sustained 50 damage. What I did was I activated active protection as well as using the staff shell, so I didn't suffer any damage from his initial burst, and I also abused a glitch that exists in the game whereby you can fire staff shell and your primary shell almost simultaneously. Now here's that 1v1 tank fight again, except in slow motion. In the opposite tank from me is a friend of mine who I know has staff shell equipped, because we wanted to test what would happen between two evenly matched tanks that both were able to abuse the quick firing staff shell glitch. The only advantage I've given myself is the fact that I have active protection as a perk whereby my opponent doesn't. Now if you've seen the previous episode of Battlefield 101, you'll know that active protection works by once the driver activates it, you have a couple of moments whereby you are invulnerable to enemy fire from enemy projectiles such as tank shells and RPGs and such, and there you can see that I have blocked his initial shot once I've activated it. But not only have I blocked his first shot, but because he fired so quickly with his secondary shot, which was the staff shell, it blocked that second shot as well, which gives me an advantage in being able to fire back 2 quick rounds, and I have not sustained any damage from his opening salvos. Now if you want to make use of this glitch, if like me you've got your controls set to veteran on the 360, is hold down the Y button, which is the button which cycles from primary to secondary weapon, and continually jab left bumper, which is your firing button. Now what happens is, by cycling from primary to secondary and jabbing left bumper, as soon as a round is available to be fired, it will reload as quickly as possible and fire it as soon as it's available. Now if you've got autoloader equipped as a perk, this obviously reduces the amount of time it takes to go through that reloading process, so you can fire off rounds in a very quick rate of time. And there you can see just how effective it is in real time. Now the only flaw against this glitch is the fact that active protection can then block your opening 2 rounds, as you saw in my case. Having it equipped at an opportune time, because he fired 2 rounds within quick succession, the active protection hadn't gone into its cooldown period, and I was able to block his opening 2 salvos instead of just 1. So that's it for this episode of Battlefield 101 and for this sequence of tank tutorials. I hope you've enjoyed this sequence and managed to learn something from it and made the tanks a more viable and exciting prospect for you to play with the next time you get in game. Until the next episode of Battlefield 101, goodbye for now.